This is a quick recap for week one, revisiting what we talked about in terms of the story of international relations. At the very beginning of class, we did a quick recap of everything we did the week before, looking at how we made a timetable and how you could use it to study and prepare for the module. We very quickly talked about what was and wasn't working before we went into more detailed aspects of the module itself. I gave you a very quick overview of what you needed to do to be successful in class. The most important thing to remember is to turn up. As you can see from this slide, people who attend do well, people who do not attend do not do well. Very quickly went over how to send emails. Remember the most important part, please put the module code into the subject line. Thank you. I went over how to book office hours. Everything is available on wasc.aston.ac.uk. Please remember that in terms of preparing for your assignments and getting feedback, your first point of contact should be with your seminar leader. I am always happy to meet with you, but they are the ones who are going to be able to help you with the most direct attention. I went over very quickly why I do not record seminars before showing you briefly how to go about doing electronic submissions, more of which will be coming in week 3. I went over your assessments. You have 3 assessments this term, due week 4, week 8, and week 13. We spent some time looking in detail at the first assessment. Then we had a group activity looking at what type of topic you wanted to pick for your assessment and a quick branch out idea on how you might answer some of the questions that are related to the assessment itself. We then had a chat about the various ideas that you came up with before I introduce you to the weekly topics. This week we looked at the idea of international relations and what is it. In week 3 we'll be looking at world order. Week 4 we'll be looking at IR as an academic subject, so realism, followed in week 5 by liberalism. Week 6 is reading week, you have no classes. Week 7 we looked at micro-political theories of international relations, before moving on to emotions, practices, and lived experience in week 8. Week 9 is nations and states. Week 10 is power and security. Week 11 is war. And week 12 we are going to be watching a movie. What I wanted to really hammer home in this particular lecture is that it's not about giving me the right answer. So going through the module outline and now turning our attention to international relations, what I want you to press you to think about is what's more important. And we talked about the fact that it's not about giving the correct answer. It's about thinking about what questions you should be asking and what stories you are being told, but also what stories are not being told. And this relates to the learning outcomes of this particular day. Hopefully, going through these slides and going through your readings, you're going to get an appreciation of the historical aspects of discipline. You're going to understand that there are a variety of ways that international relations can be studied. I introduced you to some of the topics that we're going to be looking at, but not going into very much detail, and looking at the resources and sources that you have within the discipline itself. So then we walked on to a second activity that was, what do you hope to learn in the next 23 weeks? After that, I gave you a couple different definitions of what international relations is. Remember, we did have a very long chat about the difference between capital I, capital R, and small r, and this is recapped in Chris Brown's work. We looked at what Chris Brown said international relations was, and we looked at what Kenneth Waltz said it was, before moving on to Brown and Ainley in your textbook, where they gave a couple different aspects of a very broad definition of international relations. We then looked at Andrew Haywood because his is quite different, and we drew some distinctions between what Haywood says and what Brown and Ainley say. After that, we went on to look at the idea of an academic discipline, and we suggested that it has a focus, some institutions, and traditions of thought, and I took you through what some of those are. I suggested to you that you can identify in international relations a more traditional agenda, and that now we have an emerging idea of a new agenda, although it is becoming increasingly embedded, but they do highlight some of the things that we'll be talking about in both terms before and after Christmas. We then looked at some of the institutions, Aberystwyth, London School of Economics, and the University of Oxford, where the discipline of international relations really took hold. I then went on to talk about the journals that you could be looking at, and I gave you some examples. European Journal of International Studies, the Review of International Studies, International Organizations, International Studies Quarterly, World Politics, and International Political Sociology. And I suggested to you to use Google to try and find them on your own and have a look at the table of contents. I hope that you've taken up that opportunity. I also showed you some different aspects of blogs and podcasts, suggesting The Duck of Minerva and The Disorder of Things right here are two very good blogs that you can be reading. International Relations, obviously you have the free textbook from that website, and they have plenty of other aspects that you can be using. And the London School of Economics, the British Politics and Policy blog as well. I then went on to talk about some of our institutions. We have the British International Studies Association, the European International Studies Association, the International Studies Association, the European Consortium on Political Research, and Millennium, which is a journal that hosts an annual conference in London every year. You can also have a look at some of the think tanks, and I've given you some various places where you can go and have a look on the internet as well. Moving on to traditions of thought, you've got the roots of international relations and some different ways of interpreting that as well. Now, we were very clear that these are authors that have been appropriated into the discipline, and so you have to read them with a grain of salt. Likewise, we talked about how we're going to be looking at realism and liberalism in the upcoming weeks, leaving the latter theories until second year IR course. Then we moved on to this idea of an origin stories. And the point that I tried to make was that we have to be aware of the stories that we tell to provide a foundation. They do help us understand our world, but they can exclude some aspects of the story. So you have to bear that in mind. And this is where critical thinking becomes very important. We then looked at the origin stories of international relations, and I suggested to you that there are different ways of structuring and telling that story. And each particular way, as you can see on the slide, can be a way of framing the discipline. So this is really important because to understand where we're going, some scholars suggest you need to know where we came from. Ashworth, Lucian Ashworth, talks about the need to be critical because of both the omissions and the inclusions, and what the textbooks that I've assigned to you actually tell you. And I made a point of telling you that Baylis and Smith is a very traditional textbook, whereas the Zehus and Edkins text is a lot more critical. So we then went on to look at a couple different ways of understanding the origin stories. We looked at one that engages with international political economy, and I referenced the work of Barry Buzan and George Lawson. We then went on to talk about a more geopolitical and strategic way of looking at it that came out in between the world wars, and it's associated with the idea of Halford Mackinder and his notion of the Heartland thesis. We then went on to look at the idea of 1648 and the notion that the Treaty of Westphalia became one of the origin stories central to international relations, and this is going to play a huge role in week 3 when we look at world order. We then looked at the idea of the 3 great debates and suggested that you can see a distinction between the idealists who are trying to overcome war versus the realists who are trying you can only manage chaos that leads to war, and the rise of behavioralism and particular ways of structuring knowledge. So an emphasis on universal claims, objective claims, really based on this appropriation of scientific reason. Then what we went on to conclude is to say, look at how these different stories take root and influence the textbooks that you'll be reading, because this is what you're going to see is that within the discipline it's not just one story, it's a competing set of stories that are informing each other. So you need to start thinking about which one do you buy into and what story seems to make sense to you, and these questions will help you start thinking about your assessment that's due in week 4. And then just to prepare you for week 3, start thinking as you read through the assigned readings, the idea of the origin stories that were presented to you. And what questions do you have based on what you've learned so far? So when you're doing your readings, do you agree with what's being said? Do you disagree? Are you confused? Why or why not? Write these down and come prepared to ask questions. If it's not in the lecture, then in your seminar group when it's smaller. Thank you.